Welcome to Stream of Conscience, brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, where we believe that change is possible and you can make it happen. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is Kevin Lembo, Connecticut State Comptroller. Kevin has responsibility both for overseeing the state's accounts and for managing the state's employee and retirement benefit system, including health care and pension payments. Prior to being elected as one of Connecticut's 6 constitutional officers, Kevin served 6 years as the health care advocate, educating consumers about their rights and helping them file complaints and appeals, and co-chairing the state's health care reform effort. Before becoming the health care advocate, Kevin served as assistant controller under Nancy Wyman. Kevin, welcome to Stream of Conscience.
It's great to be here, John. Thank you.
So you've been in the job for a year and a half. We had a contentious budget passed last year that had some new programs in it, like the Earned Income Tax Credit. Also had significant savings that were baked in that the governor said was going to help him manage the budget and actually produce a surplus. This year we had, of course, as always, to pass a budget supplement in the short session. So where do we stand with the budget and with the money coming in and going out?
Well, it's all about the money coming in and going out. So you're right. When we entered office in January of 2011, the projection was a $3.5 or $3.6 billion budget deficit.
Which is huge. I think the largest in the country on a per capita basis.
Exactly right. And remember that our budget is about 20, 24 billion, depending on which accounts you actually count. So the immediate action had to be to deal with that and build a budget that recognized that budget deficit. So today, as of at least the 1st of May, and we'll be reporting out again the 1st of June as we do every month, we were at about a $200 million, not billion, budget shortfall in this fiscal year. Now that's, for purposes of perspective, about 1%. So there's still time to close that. But you're right, it really was caused by some additional monies going out through the Earned Income Tax Credit and some savings targets that might have been missed, but there is still a little bit of time left.
So the fiscal year, for those who don't follow these things carefully, ends on the 30th of June.
That's correct.
And by Constitution, we have to have a balanced budget.
Yes. And
so does that mean that by the 30th of June, we need to have either cut back the spending or increase the revenues in order to balance that $200 million?
The requirement is on the construction of the budget going in. So when you build the budget, it has to be in balance based on the revenue projections and the spending projections for that biennial period. As we come out toward the end of the fiscal year, in this case we're showing a shortfall, the governor at 1% is triggered under law and forced to put a mitigation plan together that would close that gap by the end of the fiscal year. It's important to remember, though, that the closing of that gap can be done through straight up cuts in the budget, holding money back from agencies toward the end, deferring some purchases that might have been scheduled for this year and we simply can't afford them this year. Or, as has been done in years past, they could do economic recovery notes, which essentially is freezing your deficit and bonding it out. So there are a number of mechanisms. I'm not saying I agree with all of them, but there are a number of tools in the toolbox.
And which ones are the governor employing, and how do you see all of that?
He's going to use cuts to get into a zero position by the end of the fiscal year. So that sounds good on its face, but it's important to remember it really depends on what cuts he makes. So we'll have to see what he plans to do, and we're coming up on 30 days.
And so after that, then, if we make the cuts, then on the 30th or the 1st of July, the clock starts again on a new fiscal year. Monies that had been held back this year that couldn't be spent because we, quote, didn't have the money, might be spent next year because we're more hopeful that tax revenues will increase going down the line. Is that right?
Correct. But if the revenue projections stay the way they are, there is already additional spending built into that second year of the biennium. And that could just exacerbate the problem, which I think is the point that you're making. You push that payment out into the new fiscal year, and if revenue doesn't really pick up, then you've got a double problem. Payments from last year and payments into this year.
And we have as well, we had a new program we talked about very briefly, the Earned Income Tax Credit. Could you tell us what that is and how that has performed?
Yeah. It really is a program aimed at, and passed by the legislature obviously,
Yes.
Aimed at folks who are on the lower end of the economic scale and who may be paying in payroll tax through their job. Really, when you look at their overall economic condition, a decision was made that the cash that would have otherwise gone to the state might be better served in their pocket and in stimulating some of our markets. So the state did pass the plan, and it went into effect this year. First year of a new program, especially one of this size, you have to watch very carefully. And they projected a certain number for what it would cost this year, and actually that number has been exceeded. So part of the problem that we have right now is that more money is going out in the Earned Income Tax Credit than had been anticipated.
How much more?
About 200 million, generally 180 million.
And how was that in terms of the base of projection? So I don't know how much was expected to go
It was
out.
off by about 50%.
50% increase?
That's right. So folks are really taking advantage of it. They've been educated about its existence, and so if you're a proponent of the program, that's a very good thing.
Right.
It's always helpful to have solid budget numbers, and we'll know going forward what that program will cost.
And just again, because Earned Income Tax Credit is a term that I'm sure is quite well known up here, but a lot of people really don't understand how the program works. As I understand it, it allows people to file a state income tax form where they haven't actually been paying income taxes because their incomes are so low. But in fact, what we're going to do through this is to rebate to them some of the payroll taxes that they were paying at their jobs.
That's exactly right.
And so when we say it's an Earned Income Tax Credit, basically it is supplemental money going to people at the low end of the wage scale who are working, but who are the working poor.
That's exactly right.
And I think this program was actually originally envisioned by Milton Friedman, a well-known a conservative economist. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yes. And so it was a way initially for to replace some of the welfare programs to say, let's target people who are working, but they're not making enough money to get by.
Exactly.
And so the fact that more people are taking advantage of that could be, as you said, seen as a good thing, because that means that we're reaching more poor people and helping them out. But at the same time, it's helping to blow a hole in the budget.
Absolutely right. The problem, there was broad-based appeal and support for the Earned Income Tax Credit when it was passed. The problem is not in the program itself. The problem is the number that they budgeted for it, and only that.
And the last piece here I think I'd like to talk about quickly in terms of budgeting is also something that most everyone doesn't pay any attention to, which is the generally accepted accounting principles, also known as GAAP.
How to put someone to sleep at a cocktail party.
How to put somebody
Yes.
to sleep at a party. And my understanding as well is that for many, many years, the state has been using a system of accounting which allows it to be somewhat flexible, and I'll put that in quotes, as to how the budget is done and what we're really paying for and what we're not. And the governor promised when he was elected that we would move to GAAP. It's going to cost us a lot of money because we haven't been doing GAAP, and my understanding is that there was supposed to be money set aside to help fund us moving to GAAP, and that some of that money has disappeared into the budget to help balance things. Is that correct?
Almost correct. So when you make the transition to GAAP, you look at the modified cash accounting that we had been using and GAAP accounting. And the difference between those two is essentially the GAAP deficit, for lack of a better term.
Okay.
That number is at about 1.3 billion. One could be as high as 1.7 billion.
So this is not an insignificant number.
It absolutely is not. And the struggle with that number is that it's an accounting number. It's not like real cash sitting there that's going to go from A to B. It's a number that you're using to sort of realign yourself in an accounting method.
And why do you want to do that? Why is that realignment really?
For a couple of reasons. Look, we've required municipalities to keep their books under GAAP for years, but always exempted ourselves being the state, from that same requirement. The rating agencies look at the way Connecticut and some other states have been keeping their books and wondered sort of why do they perpetuate this model of accounting over another. It's important, though, to point out that it's not a magic bullet by itself. You know, if games are going to be played They can be played under GAAP and under modified cash or any other accounting method that you choose. But GAAP limits the opportunity for game playing.
Right.
It's very clear about when you post revenue and when you post expenses.
Right.
And when we report our number out, it will let, as I've said, rating agencies and arguably more importantly, the world and our state to know what these numbers actually mean. Are we pushing expenses into new fiscal years? Are we just playing games in an effort to make things appear rosier or worse than they actually are? So you're right. The governor, at the urging, I think it's safe to say, of now Lieutenant Governor Nancy Wyman, pushed for GAAP. And it was the first executive order, if I'm not mistaken,
Right.
that was signed
Yeah.
in the new administration.
Yeah.
So now you can run on GAAP, you can sign an executive order on GAAP, you can even be committed to GAAP, but transitioning to GAAP is bumpy. It's complicated.
And where are we in that process?
So this office, the Office of State Comptroller, has been largely the subject matter expert on this because Nancy was committed to GAAP before me, and I'm committed to GAAP as well. And we've been reporting out using both methods for a couple of decades now. So we're working with the Office of Policy and Management, the Governor's Budget Office, in trying to not only have the top line numbers reported under GAAP, but to build the new biennial budget under GAAP and have agencies start reporting up under GAAP. One of the commitments that have been made was if there had been a surplus in this year's budget, and this is a point I think you were making, was that we would take a piece of that surplus and apply it against the GAAP deficit each year until such time as that deficit is paid off. But we're in upside down land with the budget this year, so I don't think that that's going to happen this year. And that's a problem. It's a 50% problem for me this year. If we get into the habit by next year of doing the same thing, it's going to be a much bigger problem because we need to resolve and satisfy that obligation. But almost as importantly, or more importantly, is that the way we are operating state government is more akin to GAAP than our former way of building budgets. And that's important. For example, we had something called the 27th payroll. Every couple of years, because we have extra days in a year, you end up with a 27th payroll in any one fiscal year.
Right.
That year, actually, the actual payday was in 2009, but it was budgeted to be paid for this fiscal year. And I'm getting in the weeds here, but my point is that it was a $120 million obligation for something that occurred 3 years ago and could just as easily have been sort of tucked aside somewhere and no one would have been any wiser. But in fact, we satisfied that obligation because under GAAP, it needed to be done. And it is, I think, a testament to the commitment of folks who are running the budget now that we could have hit the ball, governor could have hit the ball, legislature could have, and decided not to.
One last quick question on the budget. Other than the earned income tax credit, which is costing us more, in terms of revenues coming in usually indicate the health of the economy, and you get your revenues through taxes, and so people don't pay taxes if they're not making money.
Right.
How's it going? What do you see on the Connecticut economy from the tax receipts?
A slightly better position now than we were a year ago or even two. But slow, bumpy, almost sawtooth kind of growth. We come up a little, we come down, but not as far as we were down. We come up a little bit more. As you know, and in Fairfield County, this is a particularly sensitive topic. The lion's share of the tax that comes in through the state income tax comes out of Fairfield County.
Right.
And a lot of that is driven by the financial districts of Wall Street and Lower Fairfield County. So
we feel like the ATM.
Right, and we appreciate your partnership. But when Wall Street's off, we're off as well.
Right. I'd like to switch to healthcare because you've spent a lot of your career in healthcare, both before you came to Connecticut, I think probably when you served under Nancy in this office as a healthcare advocate, and now you are in charge of the healthcare system for the state and the pension system. So a couple of years ago, people were pushing very hard for a program called Sustanet. When the governor came into office, he said he wasn't going to support it. I understand he thinks it's going to be too expensive. I know that you were deeply involved in thinking about how to set that program up. I'd like to know where we're going.
There's a lot of moving parts right now, as you know. So the background is correct. Sustanet was not something that the governor could support and did not. And that was, the governor and I are both Democrats. It doesn't mean we agree on all things at all times. And on this one, we have a pretty fundamental disagreement. But that said, those moving parts include the future of federal healthcare reform and what does that mean for us in our planning. Something called the partnership plans that are being administered by my office that open up new opportunities for municipalities and then some other select groups to come into the plan. The state employee and retiree health plan, that is. So there are a number of moving pieces, mostly all moving in the right direction, but all eyes are really on the Supreme Court at this point.
So if the Supreme Court does what many fear and invalidates some or all of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare,
right,
what can we do here in Connecticut to move forward to greater health care coverage for the people in the state?
So what I'm doing while all of that is happening is working forward on the partnership plans. Now, that takes the state employee retiree base and allows others to buy their coverage through that plan. We just rolled out phase one, which is for municipalities, and we're seeing tremendous savings or potential savings for these municipalities. Sometimes it's in the 5 or 6% range. In other cases, into the double digits, 20, 30% range.
Really?
Especially for small towns that really have no bargaining power in their own right.
And we have 169 towns.
All doing their own thing.
All doing their own thing.
We could have an argument about that, but I think it's probably a longer argument for another day. But, so we'll see how that plays out.
How many towns are jumping in at this point?
Well, we priced out probably a third of the cities and towns in the state at this point.
At their request?
Yes, and they're in active negotiation right now.
Okay.
So first best thing that could happen from my view is that they come into the plan.
Yep.
Because as we have more lives in the plan, we can be more innovative and share more savings.
Sure.
The second best thing, however, is if their existing carrier has their attention sharpened and they come back with a more competitive bid. And we've seen that happen in a couple of towns. At the end of the day, it's first about relief at the local level, property tax relief in particular, and secondly about larger reform issues. So I always have to remind myself to keep those two things.
Is there any sort of trend in terms of which towns are coming in? I mean, geographically or size-wise or
small
politically or whatever?
No, small first. They seem to be the most eager. Savings is larger. And the larger the municipality, the more complicated it becomes.
Sure.
More collective bargaining units, more history, potentially more folks with their finger in the pot. It really depends on what we're talking about.
And these towns, as you say, they have bargaining units, they have police unions, they have
teachers, firefighters,
clerical unions, and so they have to work with those people. How have the unions responded to this partnership program?
If there is any takeaway from all of this, it is the value of coming together early to find a solution and then moving forward together, even when it's uncomfortable. In the case of the partnership plans, it was the executive branch and labor that went together, and I would even argue that labor was out in front. So they are communicating with their local bargaining units, encouraging them, coming to meetings, pushing them toward at least an analysis of what this could mean for them. So we can accomplish a lot when we don't just assume the motivations of another or what else someone is up to or wants from us, and find common ground. And in this case, we found lots of common ground.
So you hope that by the end of the year, a third of the municipalities will be on the program?
That would be ideal. First year out, probably not that many. But even a dozen or so is a good start, because that second best use of being a specter of something in the marketplace that could remove a municipality from the roles of a commercial carrier is focusing their underwriting attention in a way that I think is beneficial. So we need to be present there.
So that program was put in place initially for municipalities,
That's right.
and then there was a second tier of that.
That's right. There are actually three tiers.
Three
The first
tiers.
tier in stages let municipalities, then nonprofits who have business with the state or
Right.
get public funding to come in. And then the third piece was for small businesses,
Okay.
which actually didn't come together. Here's where we watch the Affordable Care Act and wonder what this means for us. So if the Affordable Care Act goes down at the Supreme Court and President Obama is reelected, I think we may see greater flexibility for states because they're going to have to, they being the Obama administration, are going to have to come up with other ways to allow us to achieve these goals. Because
Right.
we all believe, and it is true, that where we're headed is just not possible. You know, more folks losing coverage and prices ever increasing. If the Affordable Care Act goes down and Mitt Romney is the president, I don't know that we will see more flexibility to the states, Romney Care notwithstanding. So he claims it should be a state-based solution. The hang-up for states is in ERISA, which is an arcane piece of federal law, but it was put in place in the 70s to protect pensions and some healthcare accounts, and becomes a stumbling block as we try to bring more lives into the state program. So even the nonprofit piece is in question at this point.
Right. The governor had asked for a letter from the Department of Labor, and that seemed to throw some doubt onto whether this could work.
Yes, Governor. You know, when you Governor did that in the fall, I was unaware of it until the response came back, and often you get from the feds what you ask. So the question is critical.
Sure.
So we are now analyzing both the governor's question and the response from the federal government, and wondering if we can't ask the question in a slightly different way.
Okay.
It has made it much more complicated, I'm sorry to say, though.
You mentioned Romney Care. Is that a model that we might look at as a state?
Well, look, the exchange piece of the federal law is built on the Massachusetts experience. So slightly different in it uses the federal programs of Medicaid to offer other coverage options. But exchanges are a piece of this. But if you're just taking the same old cast of characters, and they being the carriers, and throwing them into an exchange, there may be more transparency, but you're not doing a heck of a lot around premium relief. So subsidy for those who are working poor and still can't afford coverage, or it's not offered by their employer, is a critical piece of that. Whether states can accomplish that on their own, I'm not sure. In New England, we might be able to come into agreement with some surrounding states to construct something together. But if you're in a place in the country where your neighboring states are of one mind and you're of another, it really doesn't. A state-based solution is more labor-intensive, more complicated, and maybe all we're left with at the end of the day.
I saw a statistic the other day on it. I don't know whether this is true or whether it's just one of those floating around, but it said that 5% of the population accounts for 50% of the healthcare costs. And they were specifically looking at people who cycle through the emergency rooms in the hospital systems, and how that's, we pay for that through our insurance and through the state subsidies to hospitals and all the rest of it, but that there was a huge amount of savings possible there. Do you have any kind of leverage over that sort of approach through the pension and healthcare systems that you run?
A bit. So two pieces to my answer. One is you're absolutely right that those costs don't leave the system. Health insurance is very different than other forms of insurance in that it is at its heart social insurance. It's about me paying for you, you paying for me when we need it.
Right.
Now and in our later years when we tend to need more coverage. So that piece, together with the fact that the Medicaid program is traditionally underfunded, and often hospitals and doctors will try to offset that reimbursement on the commercial side. So that all sort of hangs together. The private pay person, heaven help them, but they're paying rack rates. You never pay retail, so they're paying more than anyone else, and sometimes when they can least afford it. So what we can do through the state plan is try to demonstrate, given this roughly 250,000 lives that I buy health care for, that investments in healthcare, in the long-term health of individuals, in good primary care, in good after-hour care, can actually bring cost savings. And we're beginning to see that already. So we've ramped up our primary care models for state employees and retirees. That's starting to show savings already. Emergency department utilization is down slightly. Primary care utilization is up slightly. Through negotiation with CBAC, there is the Health Enhancement Program, where we're trying to get the folks with 5 chronic conditions who drive a lot of our costs into more coordinated care. It's going to be a little while before we can achieve savings there, but we're getting close. So there's lots of innovative, amazing things we can do. And for me, at the end of the day, it's got to be data-driven. I may think I know where we need to go, but the data's the thing.
And one last question for our viewers who actually want to get involved in the whole healthcare debate. What's the best way to do that? How could they become more informed? Because this is such an extraordinarily complicated field.
It is, and there's lots of information out there, and some of it's not so good. So you can follow what's going on our website. You can follow our Facebook page and our Twitter feed. You can take a look at what's
This is
going
modern government.
I'm telling you, I've been dragged kicking and screaming into it. And you can also check the legislature site, as well as the Office of Healthcare Innovation, which is a governor's initiative. All these pieces are working together, and at least on a local level, you'll see a lot of information and get up to date and see when meetings are occurring if you'd like to show up. They're all public meetings. You should let your voice be heard.
I couldn't agree more. Kevin, thank you so much for your time today, and good luck with all of this, because you're right at the core of what needs to happen in this government.
For better or worse.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all our shows on YouTube by going to youtube/user/DFATVNet. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. Or you can send comments or suggestions for a show to info@dfa-tv.net. If you'd like to learn more about progressive political action, we meet at 7 p.m. on the first Wednesday of the month at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk. We'd love to have you join us. Remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience, and I'm your host, John Hartwell. Thanks for watching.